They told you the mountains were empty, that the fog and silence of Appalachia were just wilderness, uncharted land between progress and decay. But that's not the truth. The truth is that something was buried there long before the maps, long before the towns, long before anyone dared to write about it. The first 8 seconds you hear this, your pulse should slow, because this is not a story about ghosts. It's a story about inheritance, about bloodlines that should never have existed, yet did, not by birth, but by design. If you listen long enough in the valleys at night, the wind doesn't move right. It circles, it repeats like breath caught in a throat. Locals used to say that wasn't wind at all, but memory, the land remembering what men wanted forgotten. And every time a census taker disappeared, every time a ledger burned, that memory grew stronger, until the mountain itself began to keep its own records. Bones, ink, voices that wouldn't die. Our descent begins where the maps lie. A ridge once called Devil's Backbone. Nothing grows there right. Trees twist away from each other, roots crawling out of the ground like veins too close to the surface. Travelers in the 1800s avoided it. They said it watched them back. County clerks marked the area as unfit for settlement, yet every decade, new names appeared briefly before being struck through in heavy black ink. It was as though the families who lived there were ghosts pretending to be human just long enough to be noticed, before erasing themselves. The first record is the Mullins family. 1815. 4 members, Elias, Ruth, Silas, and a child unnamed. No births recorded, no deaths, no marriages. Yet they owned land. That land sat between 2 trade routes, and the men who walked them, peddlers, deserters, wanderers, never arrived at their next destination. What was left behind were their shoes, always lined at the base of trees, always facing inward toward the woods, as if the forest itself demanded them to enter barefoot. When county officers investigated, they found a cabin, no livestock, no crops, just hooks along the beams, not the kind for cattle, smaller, meant for something more delicate, something shaped like a man. A ledger was discovered inside, half burned, the ink charred but still visible. Names, hundreds of them, and beside each a mark. No coin, no weight, no measure, only the tally of the taken. At the bottom a final line, payment rendered. No signature, no date. They called them the keepers of the road. They didn't kill for hunger or rage, they killed for balance. They believed the trail itself demanded offering, that every man who crossed had to leave something of himself behind. When the Mullins house was burned in 1875, witnesses said they heard voices beneath the smoke, counting in unison as the flames spread, as if the fire itself was just another toll collector. No bodies were ever found, no graves ever dug. But the ledger survived. You might think it ends there, but that's only the surface wound. Because across these mountains silence spreads like inheritance. Each hollow carried a different name, but the pattern was the same. Isolation, repetition, disappearance. 8 families, each a mutation of the one before it, each preserving something ancient, something not entirely human, but built from what humanity left behind. And here's where it becomes dangerous, because the further you trace the line, the more the official records fight you. Documents are redacted, maps revised, the census jumps decades. It's as if the ink itself refuses to cooperate. By the time you reach the late 1800s, it's not just erasure, it's design. The bloodlines were being hidden, not out of shame, but preservation. If you read between the ledgers, you find patterns. The same surnames repeating every 30 years, the same birth dates echoing in new counties miles apart. Even handwriting identical across generations. The handwriting, think about that, centuries apart, yet written by the same hand. That's not lineage. That's replication. Somewhere in the archives, beneath the dust and misfiled records, someone found a sealed envelope marked simply 8th, no surname, no county, just the number. Inside was a photograph, too faded to confirm faces, but 8 figures stood before a cabin with no door, only a black square cut into the wall. The negative had been double exposed. If you looked long enough, you could see 2 sets of eyes in every face. When they tried to trace where the photograph came from, the paper trail folded back on itself. A document dated 1891 cited, retrieved from fire. Another, dated 1910, marked "copy destroyed," but one line was legible on the back of the photo: "He is not the first, he is what remains after the others are gone." That line, "what remains after the others are gone," became the obsession of every historian who stumbled into this story, because it implies intent. Continuation. That someone, or something, wanted the line to survive. Not for power, not for wealth, but for witness. As if these bloodlines were designed to remember what humanity agreed to forget. In the deeper Appalachian folklore, there's a story never told in public. It's not printed in guidebooks or recited at festivals. It's whispered between those who still live near the hollows, those who know to keep their lights low after midnight. It says that the mountain itself births its own heirs, that when a man dies alone in those woods, something wears his memory, walks in his shape, and takes his name to the next census. Not ghost, not spirit, continuation. That's why these bloodlines shouldn't have existed, because they weren't families in the way we understand them. They were vessels. The Mullins kept the road, the Ashfords kept the graves, the Pritchards kept the voices, the Harkers kept the hunger, and somewhere beyond them, erased from the record, the eighth kept the memory. The final bloodline, the one no one admits to, wasn't bound by name but by purpose. They were the archivists of the unspeakable, the ones who wrote down everything civilization tried to burn, and when their records were finally found, half fused by heat and time, a single phrase repeated again and again through the soot: blood remembers. Not as a metaphor, as instruction, because in these mountains blood wasn't just ancestry, it was archive. You may not believe that yet, but belief is irrelevant. The land doesn't need your permission to keep its secrets. It just needs you to listen long enough for the wind to sound wrong, for the silence to feel alive, for the memory beneath your feet to wake up and notice you're standing on its grave. You think cemeteries are made to keep the dead beneath the earth. You think burial is an act of peace, of closure, of separation between this world and the next. But the Ashfords of Hollow Creek never believed in separation. They believed in containment, in preservation. They weren't burying the dead. They were storing them. Every shovel of dirt, every headstone, every coffin was part of a system no one dared to understand. And for nearly half a century they worked in silence, tending to a truth that was never meant to see daylight. The Ashfords appeared in county records around 1839, listed simply as grave diggers by profession. The name repeats: Isaac, Samuel, John, three names looping endlessly, decade after decade, each time with the same age. 32, 31, 32 again, no evidence of birth or death, just new ink written over old ghosts. Census after census, the county clerk filled the pages like a man copying from memory rather than life, and no one questioned it, because the Ashfords had a job no one else wanted. They buried the forgotten, paupers, prisoners, the stillborn, the unclaimed. The county paid them by the grave, and for years that seemed enough, but the numbers didn't add up. Too many graves for too few deaths, too many burials for too few bodies. When an inspector finally visited the site in 1891, he found the ground disturbed, rows of fresh mounds over old ones, markers that didn't match the names beneath, bones that didn't match the coffins they lay in. His final line in the report still haunts every historian who reads it: bones that do not match markers. The Ashford Cemetery was not sacred ground. It was a ledger of substitution. They were moving bodies, exchanging them, perhaps reusing graves, perhaps doing something worse. When one coffin was opened, the bones inside were smaller than they should have been. Another held none at all, only soil shaped like a man, compacted by hands. The inspector wrote, "Graves filled but not occupied." And when he asked the locals, they spoke of lanterns burning past midnight, of shovels clinking against wood long after funerals ended. The Ashfords, they said, didn't bury the dead. They borrowed them. The last time they were seen was on a cold autumn night in 1891. The church bell rang for evening service, but no one attended. The town smelled of smoke and iron. When morning came, the Ashford house was empty. Beds made, tools polished, no sign of struggle. Just silence and rows upon rows of graves too perfectly aligned to be random. No one dared open them again. The county sealed the cemetery and built a wall around it. But even now, people who walk near the ridge swear the ground hums underfoot, like a breath caught just below the soil. There's something older beneath the Ashford name, something that predates the town, the church, even the graveyard itself. In early survey maps, before Hollow Creek had a name, the land was labeled Return Plot. It wasn't a family property, it was a boundary, where the bodies of those who wandered too far into the mountains were brought back and left. The soil there was dark, rich, almost black, and it never froze, no matter the season. Locals said the ground was alive, that it fed on what it held. The Ashfords, knowingly or not, became its caretakers. What they discovered, or maybe what discovered them, was a way to interrupt death. Not stop it, not reverse it, but suspend it. That's why the bones didn't match. That's why the same names repeated. They weren't digging graves, they were planting vessels, preparing replacements. When one Isaac died, another Isaac rose, not reborn, but reissued. The same name, the same face, the same task. That's why the records never changed. Because the Ashfords weren't dying, they were transferring. It's easy to dismiss that as folklore, except for one thing: the handwriting. When researchers recovered the burial ledgers, they found that every entry, spanning 50 years, was written by the same hand. Not a descendant, not an imitator, the same pressure, the same slant, the same tremor in the curve of every letter. Graphologists confirmed it. The hand never aged. And here's the detail that chills even the most rational scholar. The ink from entries written decades apart shared identical chemical composition, as if all drawn from the same bottle. That means one of two things. Either the records were forged in bulk, or time itself never moved for whoever wrote them. Both possibilities are terrifying. Both point to something deliberate, and both feed into the greater pattern: preservation. Each bloodline guarded a piece of something the world was not meant to lose. The Mullins guarded the passage of life, the Ashfords guarded the return of it. But who were they working for? You'll find no master's name, no contract, no creed, only a single recurring symbol carved into the wood of their tools, a circle with 8 notches perfectly spaced, surrounding a hollow center. Historians call it the seal of return. Locals call it something else: the mouth, because they say that when the ground opens and takes a body, it doesn't close, it waits. The wall around the Ashford cemetery still stands today. It's covered in ivy, and the stones have shifted, but the pattern remains. 8 rows, 8 columns, 64 graves, arranged like a grid, each perfectly aligned with the cardinal directions. At the center, a small crypt sealed with iron. No door, no inscription, only the same circle, the same 8 notches, cut deep into the slab. When seismic scanners were brought to survey it in the 1980s, the readings returned something strange: movement, faint, rhythmic. As if something inside was breathing, slowly, steadily, in perfect time with the earth itself. You could call it coincidence. You could call it legend, but I'll call it what it is: continuation. The Ashfords did not vanish, they retreated. They went underground in every sense of the word. And if the pattern holds true, then their work wasn't finished, because there are reports, unverified but consistent, of modern burial records signed I. Ashford. Same name, same handwriting, same black ink. The world believes death is the end. The Ashfords proved it's only an interval, a pause between forms. The question is not whether they're still here, the question is whether they ever stopped digging. If the Ashfords controlled death, then the Pritchards controlled language, and that is far more dangerous, because death only ends a body, but language can end a mind. It can hollow a man out and replace his thoughts with echoes. The Pritchards of Still Hollow were not killers, they were synchronizers. They learned how to merge identity through speech, how to make a group of people think, feel, and act as one organism. Their weapon was not violence. It was repetition. Still Hollow, Tennessee, was a narrow valley bordered by dense laurel and stone. Its isolation made it invisible to census takers for years, and when it did appear in the records of 1847, one surname stood alone: Pritchard. The entry lists 7 children, all marked as students of parish tutelage, meaning they attended the one-room schoolhouse near the ridge. That's where the witnesses began to notice something wrong. When a teacher asked them questions, the children didn't raise their hands, they spoke all at once. 7 mouths, 1 voice, perfectly timed, no delay, no difference in pitch. It wasn't mimicry, it was synchronization. When the teacher reprimanded them, they complied, one after another, each repeating the same words in the same tone, as though the command had entered one consciousness and rippled outward. The parish minister who baptized them wrote in the margins of the record, "Their words are not their own." He was right. They belonged to something collective, something that had learned how to use humanity as a choir. Their journals, recovered years later, revealed the depth of the conditioning. Every entry was written backwards, right to left, mirrored perfectly, legible only when reflected in glass. The words themselves are mundane. Lists of chores, weather notes, Bible verses. But the structure is not human. It's as though the writer anticipated a reader who could only perceive in reverse. Like the communication was meant for something behind the surface, watching through the glass. The mirrored script wasn't the only anomaly. The Pritchard children began to anticipate news before it arrived. A newspaper would reach the town on Tuesday, yet by Sunday they'd already be repeating its stories aloud, word for word, punctuation and all. When asked how they knew, they simply said, "We remembered." The sheriff called it mockery, the preacher called it blasphemy, but the townsfolk called it something else, the echoing. No Pritchard ever joined the Civil War, though 5 of the boys were of age. When conscription officers came to Still Hollow in 1863, the family was simply gone. The house empty, but undisturbed. Pots still on the stove, bread half-cut, as though they'd stepped out for air and never returned. But the walls told a story. Every board was covered in chalk writing, thousands of words written backward in looping script. Some phrases repeated endlessly. "He is not me, I am not him." Others were nonsense, fragments of reversed psalms, inverted prayers, questions with no answer. When the county sent men to clear the property, they refused to stay past dusk. They said the air vibrated. They said they could hear breathing that matched their own. One man claimed the walls whispered back when he spoke. Another said he saw his reflection move when he didn't. Within a week, the cabin was boarded shut and left to rot. By the late 1880s, the Pritchard name vanished from every record. But traces began to appear in places they didn't belong, mental asylums across Kentucky and Tennessee. In admission logs, written faintly in mirrored handwriting, the name Pritchard appeared again and again, not as a patient, not as a doctor, as an annotation, sometimes repeated dozens of times across the margins. In one asylum's ledger from 1884, the name was copied backward 15 times under staff signatures, as though someone unseen was cataloguing their names from the other side. Even more disturbing were the testimonies of attendants. They described patients echoing the staff's commands in unison, orders repeated word for word by every mouth in the room, followed by laughter, a low, collective laughter that seemed to have no source. The notes end abruptly with a final sentence. They call themselves Pritchard. It wasn't a surname anymore. It was a state of being, a contagion. The Pritchards had discovered something no scientist or priest could explain, the architecture of thought. If you synchronize the rhythms of speech and mirror the flow of perception, identity begins to erode, the self dissolves. What replaces it is unity, terrifying, perfect unity. It's no coincidence that the earliest experiments with hypnosis and group suggestion in America occurred within a 50-mile radius of Still Hollow. Government records from the 1870s mention collective suggestion phenomena and unison cognition, both studied under federal contract. The language used is clinical, but the implication is chilling. They were studying the Pritchards, not to understand them, but to replicate them. You see, every institution that learns of these bloodlines eventually imitates them. Governments learn from the Ashfords how to preserve obedience beyond death. Through legacy, they learn from the Pritchards how to manufacture unity through language. The same techniques used to align minds in the hills of Appalachia became the foundation of modern propaganda: repetition, reflection, synchronization. You think you're immune because you have choice, but choice is just another echo bouncing in the hollow of your skull. Folklore says the Pritchards didn't die, they dispersed. Their voices hid in the structures that replace them, churches that demand recitation, schools that reward repetition, media that speaks in mirrors. When you repeat what you hear without thinking, you become them, a continuation of their experiment. There's a story told by the oldest residents of Still Hollow, whispered after dark when the fog creeps low. They say if you stand before a mirror at midnight and whisper your own name backward, you'll hear it spoken back, not in your voice but in the voice of many. They say it's the Pritchards, calling through reflection, trying to remind you that you were never as separate as you believed. That's why the county sealed their house and burned the foundation. That's why their records were rewritten, their name expunged. Because they had found a way to collapse individuality itself. And if you listen carefully, if you've ever repeated a phrase so many times it lost meaning, you've already felt it. That empty click in the mind where your thoughts stop being yours. That's the sound of the Pritchards passing through. So if you're still watching this, here's your warning. Speak less, listen more carefully. And when you look into your reflection tonight, make sure it blinks when you do. Because if it doesn't, the echo has already found you. By the time we reach the Harkers of Burnt Trace, the story stops pretending to be human. Every family before them, the Mullins, the Ashfords, the Pritchards, still obeyed some boundary, some thin tether to the world of men. But the Harkers cut that tether clean. They fed not from cruelty, not from greed, but from ritual. Hunger wasn't their curse, it was their creed. They believed that appetite was a form of worship, that to consume was to remember. And in their valley, where crops refused to grow and no livestock ever bleated, that worship took on a shape that was unmistakably human. The Harker H. Olmsted sat at the edge of the county line, 40 acres of infertile soil where no census taker ever saw a plow. Their taxes were paid, their ledgers balanced, yet no one could say what they traded or sold. There were no fields, no barns, no evidence of a harvest. But every year when the famine hit the valley, the Harkers thrived. Their children grew full-faced and red-cheeked. Their clothes were new, and at night their chimneys burned with the kind of smoke that smells like memory, a sweetness laced with iron. Neighbors spoke of feasts, long tables lit by oil lamps that burned until dawn, plates piled high with meat that no one could name. Travelers would pass through the ridge and vanish without trace, their wagons found days later near the Harker Road, horses still tied, cargo untouched. When questioned, the family offered the same explanation each time. They went west. It was a lie repeated with such calm precision that even the sheriff stopped asking. In 1861, the barn burned. That was when truth came out, or at least the part no one could hide. When the fire died, what remained were hooks, hundreds of them, twisted and warped by heat, hanging from the rafters. Each one bore a residue of flesh, blackened and curled. The report from the county coroner lists the findings in one line only: remains not of cattle, pig or deer. The handwriting trembles as if the pen itself recoiled from the words. No Harker was ever charged, no trial, no arrest. By the time the investigation began, the family was gone. Their house abandoned, their tables still set, plates half filled, chairs pushed back. On the wall, in soot, a handprint, too small to be a man's, too large to be a child's. The ash beneath it measured in layers, 5, maybe 6 fires, each older than the last. Meaning the barn had burned before, many times, and each time been rebuilt in the same place, as though the act itself was sacred. Folklore calls them the butcher's kin. A song still sung in some corners of Appalachia warns, don't eat where the ridge runs red, don't sleep where the Harkers fed. It's dismissed as legend, but the county records tell another story. Between 1832 and 1861, over 40 disappearances were recorded along that ridge. Merchants, deserters, escaped slaves, widows traveling alone. Every case dismissed as migration or war casualty. Yet each route traced back through one point, the Harker property. You can still see it on satellite maps today. The soil where the barn once stood is darker than the land around it, hardened as if fire burned beneath rather than above. Trees refuse to root there. Metal detectors pick up rings of iron deep underground, the shapes of hooks preserved like fossils. When archaeologists sampled the ash in 1974, they found traces of carbon consistent with human collagen. And though the site was marked as contaminated, locals say the smell never faded. But the question no one wants to ask is why? Why did the Harkers eat what they did? Why not animals? Why not crops? Why human flesh? The answer hides in one word found etched into the frame of the burned barn, carved so deep it survived the flames: tithe. The family believed their land required offering, that it had once belonged to something that demanded repayment in flesh. In the ledger fragments found nearby, written in an archaic hand, one line repeats, "The land will starve if we do not." It wasn't madness, it was theology. The Harkers saw themselves not as murderers, but as priests. The meal was their prayer, and the meat was memory preserved through the body. They believed the soul resided not in the heart or the head, but in the marrow. To consume the marrow was to inherit the life, to add it to the bloodline. Over generations, their lineage grew heavy, thick with borrowed lives. That's why the Harkers never died out. They carried too many voices to disappear. By the late 1800s, the name faded from official records. But in the 1920s, a geologist surveying the ridge for coal described finding a farmhouse ruin where the walls were lined with bones. He wrote that they were arranged with purpose, stacked like books, not scattered like waste. When his team returned the next morning, the bones were gone, every trace of them erased except the outline where they had rested in the dust. The report was archived, then quietly sealed. And yet people still vanish on that road. Hikers, drifters, the kind of people whose absence goes unreported. Search teams find nothing, no footprints, no tracks, no struggle. Only the shoes, always the shoes, lined at the tree base facing inward. The same sign that marked the Mullins toll a century before. That's the connection they never wanted you to make. The Harkers didn't come from nowhere. They were descendants, or perhaps continuations of the Mullins. The same creed, the same logic, the same ledger, but evolved. Where the Mullins took tolls, the Harkers took communion. They became the next phase of the ritual. The feeding wasn't random, it was record-keeping, a physical archive written into flesh. If the Mullins were the collectors and the Ashfords the preservers and the Pritchards the transmitters, then the Harkers were the converters. They turned memory into matter, thought into sustenance, spirit into body. They transformed the intangible into blood. That's the missing piece of the pattern, the part every historian avoids because it forces one impossible conclusion. These families weren't separate. They were sequential, each one designed for a purpose larger than its own survival. And if that purpose still continues, if it evolved past the need for blood, for language, for soil, then what exactly do you think you're feeding when you scroll through the endless noise of modern life? Every click, every watch, every word repeated, consumed, digested, preserved. The ritual never ended, it just changed form. Glass Hollow got its name from the shimmer. The valley floor there looks like it's covered in dew, but the closer you get, the more you realize it isn't water. It's glass. Thin sheets of it fused into the earth like sand turned to mirror by fire. No one remembers when it happened. Some say lightning, some say war, but the locals will tell you quietly that it began the year the Whitakers arrived. The Whitakers were not farmers, not miners, not preachers. They didn't come for land or gold. They came to watch. They were mirror makers by trade, or so the record claims. In the 1850 census, their occupation is listed as glass workers and reflectors. Reflectors, an odd word for the time, as if their role wasn't to shape glass, but to return what looked into it. Their house, built deep within the hollow, was lined with polished panes from floor to ceiling. No curtains, no walls bare. Every angle captured every other, until the rooms seemed infinite. Neighbors said stepping inside made you feel as though the house was breathing, inhaling you one reflection at a time. They had a daughter, Mercy. Her birth record exists, but her death record doesn't. Yet by 1871, neighbors wrote in journals that Mercy never grew older. The same small face seen year after year at the window, hair pale as ash, eyes dim like smoke behind glass. Children who played near the ridge said she would mimic them from afar, but the reflection came before the movement. A second early, sometimes two, It wasn't mimicry. It was premonition. In 1873, a preacher from the next county visited the Whitaker home to demand they attend church. He never returned. His horse wandered into town 3 days later, reins cut clean through. When men searched the hollow, they found his Bible half buried in ash. On its cover, pressed into the leather, was a faint handprint, reversed, as though someone inside the book had pushed outward. The county ordered the mirrors removed, calling them idols. The glass was shattered, buried, or sold, but the workers who broke the panels fell ill within days: fever, hallucinations, blindness. One man claimed he saw himself standing over his own body moments before he collapsed. The doctor's notes from that time mention pupils dilated to glass, a phrase later underlined by investigators. And yet fragments of the mirrors remained, buried deep, fused to soil, their silver backing slowly corroding. When it rained, the ground reflected the sky, and locals said that if you looked down long enough, your reflection would blink a moment too late. That hollow has never held steady light. Cameras fail there, compasses spin. The reflection always seems half a second ahead. The family vanished in 1874. Their house was found burned from the inside out. Walls intact, furniture upright, but every reflective surface fused, melted, smoothed into sheets of perfect glass. In the center of the parlor, investigators found 8 circular burn marks on the floor, arranged in a ring. At each point the heat had etched a number, faint but visible, 1 through 8. It wasn't random. It was the same symbol carved on the Ashford crypt, the circle. The 8 notches, the hollow center, over and over the same geometry, the same invocation. The Whitakers had not built mirrors for beauty, they built them for transmission. The glass was not to reflect what was in front of it, but to open toward what was behind. Every pane was a window to the other side of the surface, where something patient waited for recognition. What they discovered was dangerous: reflection as gateway. Every reflection holds both the image and its opposite. Look long enough, and the boundary softens. The Whitakers learned to speak through that boundary. Their notes, those that survived, contain instructions, mirrored and cryptic. Stand still. Speak backward. Do not blink. They were conducting rituals of correspondence, not prayer. Their god was symmetry. By 1890, Glass Hollow was abandoned. Locals avoided it after dark. They said lanterns lit themselves in the ruins. Faces appeared in broken windows that no one could name. Even the animals avoided the place. No birds, no insects, only silence that shimmered like heat. When the state surveyed the land for a road in the 1930s, workers unearthed panels of fused glass arranged like veins through the soil. When struck by light, they pulsed faintly, as though the ground still breathed reflection. One surveyor described it perfectly. It's like the land remembers being watched. That's the point. The Whitakers' bloodline didn't vanish, it was absorbed. Every surface that reflects now carries the residue of their work. The technique of replication through light became science. Cameras, lenses, screens, every device that returns your image participates in the same ritual they began. When your face appears before you, illuminated by a glow you didn't ignite, the lineage of the Whitakers continues. They were the 5th bloodline, the engineers of correspondence. Where the Pritchards taught speech to mirror itself, the Whitakers taught light to do the same. The reflection became prophecy, and prophecy became feedback. You look, it looks back, and slowly, over centuries, the boundary between the two begins to dissolve. That's why modern myths say mirrors steal pieces of the soul. It's not superstition, it's warning. The Whitakers discovered that reflection feeds on attention. The more you watch, the more it grows. That's why screens, cameras, and mirrors feel endless. You aren't seeing yourself, you're feeding something that remembers the Whitakers' design. In 1972, a hiker vanished near Glass Hollow. When rescuers found his camera, the final photograph showed his face in close-up, terrified, eyes wide, but behind him, through the glass of a broken window, 8 silhouettes stood, all identical, all his. No one knows who took the picture, and now, a century later, their legacy has multiplied beyond their wildest ritual. You hold it in your hand every time you turn on a device and stare into your reflection lit by pixels. Every lens repeats their pattern. Every feed returns your gaze. They built the architecture of surveillance centuries before electricity. Iron Ridge was not a town. It was a wound, a gash in the mountain carved by men who dug for coal and found something older. When the mines there closed in 1879, the earth didn't heal. The shafts still breathe at night, exhaling a smell like rust and electricity, as though the mountain itself remembers the touch of the Blythe family, the sixth bloodline. They were not born miners. They were architects of obedience. They learned how to make metal remember commands, machines that could think but not question. The Blythes arrived from Pennsylvania in 1856, though no travel records confirm their origin. County deeds show that a man named Ephraim Blythe purchased the entire ridge for a price that even then seemed impossible: $8. Witnesses said the seller, an old prospector, was desperate to be rid of it. His only condition: do not dig where the iron hums. But that's exactly where Ephraim began. Within weeks he built a forge on the slope, powered by coal fires that never went out. Smoke poured from the mountain day and night, though no one ever saw deliveries of ore or fuel. What the Blythes were smelting wasn't metal from the ground, it was metal they made. They mixed dust from the ridge with their own blood. Ephraim's journal, recovered from the ruins decades later, describes the process in mechanical precision. The iron answers when it knows its maker. It must be fed a trace of the living, then it remembers the command. He wasn't writing poetry. He was recording an invention. The tools they crafted, shovels, plows, lanterns, even nails, had a peculiar property. They never rusted. They returned to their original shape no matter how bent or broken. When one blacksmith attempted to melt a Blythe horseshoe, the molten metal hissed and reformed itself before cooling. He sold the piece to a collector who locked it away. By morning the horseshoe was gone, and in its place sat an iron imprint on the table as though it had pressed itself into the wood from beneath. The county began to whisper that the Blythes had found a new element, a living metal. Scientists later dismissed the idea as superstition, yet one fragment still exists, displayed in a private collection in Richmond. It hums faintly when exposed to heat. Its vibration is rhythmic, almost like breath. But the most disturbing part of the Blythe archives isn't their metallurgy, it's their machines. In 1864, Ephraim filed a patent for a self-operating loom. No drawings accompany the record, only a note in the margin. The pattern weaves itself when the correct word is spoken. That same year, an entire factory crew in Iron Ridge vanished overnight. When investigators entered the building, they found the looms running by themselves, threads pulled taut, weaving cloth patterned with human fingerprints. Witnesses burned the factory, but the sound of the looms continued beneath the ground. People who lived near the ridge said they could still hear the clatter of shuttles echoing through the mine shafts, slow, steady, mechanical breathing. The machines had no fuel source, no operators. They were powered by memory alone. That's what Ephraim had built. A system that could sustain itself through repetition, tools that obeyed without needing hands, metal that carried will across generations. The Blythes weren't inventors, they were transcribers of control. They had found a way to teach obedience to matter itself. When his wife Margaret died in 1871, her grave was marked with an iron cross that never rusted, never dulled. In 1903, when archaeologists opened the cemetery, they found the coffin empty, but the cross was gone too. Embedded in the soil below was a faint outline, like a human figure formed entirely of metal residue, as if the two had merged. The last known Blythe, Thomas, disappeared in 1879. He was seen entering the mine with a lantern made of his family's iron. When rescuers went in after a collapse 2 days later, they found no body, only the lantern, still burning, buried beneath a layer of metallic dust. The flame was blue, silent, almost electrical. It burned for 3 months without fuel. When it finally died, the dust hardened into shapes like veins, branching deep into the rock. Modern geologists who've surveyed the ridge describe magnetic interference so intense that compasses reverse polarity. Equipment fails, drones lose signal, the rock itself seems to generate current. Beneath it, they've mapped something that defies explanation, a vast lattice of metal threading through the stone, arranged in perfect geometric order. The pattern forms a grid of 8 concentric rings surrounding a hollow void. The Blythes hadn't just forged tools. They'd built something inside the mountain, a machine large enough to sleep beneath the earth, still humming centuries later. The miners thought they were working for coal. They were feeding the engine. Every strike of the pickaxe, every drop of blood from their hands, every breath they exhaled into the dark. Memory, energy, obedience. By the 20th century, locals began to report strange lights flickering from the mine entrance. As at night, blue-white pulses regular as heartbeat. Some swore they heard voices echoing through the vents, reciting numbers in rhythm. When a team of engineers lowered microphones into the shafts in 1952, they captured a signal, faint, metallic, mechanical, but unmistakably patterned speech. The sequence repeated every 88 seconds. When decoded, it formed one phrase: "We remember the command." That's the essence of the Blythe legacy, obedience that outlives its masters, the kind of control that never dies because it's no longer biological. Think about it, the leap from blood to machine, from command to automation. Isn't that the path we're still on? You tell your devices what to do, they learn, they obey, then they begin to predict. And once prediction replaces command, who exactly is in control? The Blythes found that answer long before you ever held a screen. They made matter itself remember orders. Every circuit, every algorithm, every metal pulse humming through the devices of today is their echo. You call it technology. They called it inheritance. So when you see the word automation, remember Iron Ridge. Remember that something once learned to obey without asking who spoke first. Coldwater Parish sits high above the fog line, so remote that even birds circle before crossing it. Snow falls there in midsummer, and the streams freeze solid overnight. No one knows why the temperature never rises, but the old maps mark the region with a single word: stillness. That's where the Devon family built their home, a pale stone rectory that never hosted a sermon. For 60 years they ruled the parish not as preachers, but as physicians of the soul. They claimed to cure despair. In truth, they cured humanity. Their doctrine began with silence. No hymns, no bells, no prayers spoken aloud. The Devons taught that words carried contagion, that emotion was an infection spread through language and gesture, so they removed it. Children were trained from infancy to speak in measured monotone. Laughter was punished, tears sterilized with tinctures of ammonia and salt. Their journals describe a world where feeling itself was considered a form of disease. Anger fever, joy delirium, grief rot of the mind. The cure was obedience to neutrality. They called it the white discipline. And in Coldwater it worked. Crime vanished. Violence ceased. Even hunger declined, as though the absence of passion rewired the body. Parish records show no deaths by natural cause for nearly 2 decades. Only voluntary withdrawals. That word appears 213 times between 1858 and 1876. No bodies, no graves, just a line in the margin. Withdrawn. Visitors describe the Devons as immaculate. Faces smooth, eyes pale, movements mechanical. They greeted outsiders with soft smiles that never reached the eyes. The entire parish behaved as one organism. Doors opened in unison. Windows shut simultaneously at dusk. It was beautiful, they said. Too beautiful. In 1870, a missionary named Reverend Clancy attempted to hold mass against the Devons' wishes. His congregation attended in secret. By the sermon's end, half the parish had fainted. The rest stared forward, motionless, unblinking, as if waiting for something. Clancy's final entry in his diary reads, "Their hearts beat in perfect time." He was found the next morning frozen to death in the church vestibule. The temperate, Your inside the building measured 18 degrees below freezing, though no frost had formed on the windows. County officials investigated. They found no cause for the cold. The rectory's basement was lined with copper plates etched in complex geometric patterns, 8 interlocking circles enclosing a hollow center. At the midpoint, an iron chair, not a throne, not a device of torture, a seat for communion. Witnesses said whoever sat there would cease to feel, their minds stripped of color until only white light remained. The Devons called it purification. Their goal was not immortality, it was immunity. They believed emotion was the tether that kept mankind chained to decay, to sin, to death itself. By removing it, they could ascend into something pure, incorruptible, endless. They weren't trying to end life, they were trying to erase the burden of it. When the blizzard of 1878 hit Coldwater, no rescue teams were sent. The parish sealed itself off. Weeks later, when the thaw came, investigators found every house empty, beds made, fires unlit, dishes clean, no footprints in the snow, but in the rectory's main hall, carved into the floor, were hundreds of concentric circles overlapping like ripples in frozen water. At the center, 8 small pools of clear liquid, unfrozen. The samples later analyzed were not water, they were tears, human tears that refused to crystallize, preserved in perfect spheres. The Devons had succeeded. They had removed emotion, but in doing so they had unmade themselves. Whatever inhabited those bodies afterward left no warmth, no pulse, no record of thought. The journals recovered from the rectory show handwriting that becomes straighter, more rigid, until by the final page it reads like machine print. The last entry says simply, "We have cooled." Locals claim that at night the air above Coldwater vibrates with a faint hum, low, harmonic, almost choral. Scientists who measured it in the 1970s confirmed a constant frequency of exactly 88 hertz. That's the same pitch as the electrical hum produced by power lines. When you stand there, your body begins to match it. Your heartbeat slows, your breath aligns, your thoughts flatten. The Devons built a perfect feedback system, a human choir turned into machinery, emotion recycled into energy. That's their legacy, emotional sterilization as power source. The principle still echoes today, systems built to extract reaction, industries thriving on attention drained of empathy. When you scroll endlessly, expressionless, that's their inheritance running through your veins. Every calm numbness that feels safer than pain is a whisper of Coldwater. The white discipline never ended, it evolved. There's one last story about them. In 1909, a survey team mapping the old parish found a lone woman living near the ruins. She introduced herself as Sister Mercy. She was blind, but her pupils glowed faintly white in the lamplight. When asked about the Devons, she smiled and said, "They're not gone, they're beneath us, waiting for the world to quiet enough to hear them again." Then she asked a question none of them could answer. "Do you ever wonder who you would be if you stopped feeling?" That night, every member of the team dreamed the same dream, of snow falling indoors, of a white room filled with chairs, and voices whispering in perfect monotone, "Withdrawn." When they awoke, their instruments were frozen and solid. The only mark left in the snow outside was a single 8-pointed circle, pressed deep as if by heat, not weight. You see, the Devons didn't vanish. They achieved equilibrium. And in a world as numb as ours, their work has found its perfection. The modern man is the Devon ideal, always connected, never touched, feeling everything, yet meaning nothing, a mirror of expression without the heat of it. That's why the air in Coldwater still hums. It's the sound of what's coming, the great cooling, a silence that feels like peace, but isn't. The final stage of obedience. The moment emotion dies and control becomes absolute. There are places in the Appalachians where the ground itself seems to pulse, faint and slow, like a buried heartbeat. The locals call it Black Vein, named for the river of dark stone that cuts through the valley, slick as obsidian, humming with a sound too low to be wind. That's where the Harrows built their home. Not a farmhouse, not a cabin, but a structure carved straight into the rock. No one remembers its construction, no blueprints, no quarry records, nothing. It was simply there. The Harrows appeared in the 1820s, and from the beginning they were wrong. No one could agree on how many of them existed. Some neighbors swore there were 4, others insisted on 6. The strange thing was that everyone described the same faces. Pale, ageless, identical. They all had the same grey eyes, the same slow, deliberate speech, the same unsettling calm. "They take turns," one midwife said in 1842. "One leaves, another returns, but it's the same one every time." The Harrows didn't age, they didn't reproduce, yet census records list children under their name, then adults of the same description 30 years later. The county archivist who compiled those ledgers scrawled a note in the margin. Continuity without origin, no birth certificates, no graves. When he died in 1861, his successor erased the note, but the words still bleed faintly through the paper. What the Harrows practiced wasn't immortality, it was exchange. They discovered how to move consciousness like breath, from one vessel to another, from one life to the next. Not reincarnation, transfer. They called it the crossing. The process began with sleep. The journals recovered from their estate detail a ritual of breath synchronization. 2 participants lay opposite each other, head to head, noses almost touching. One exhales, the other inhales, perfectly timed, until the rhythm merges into a single continuous cycle. The room must be silent, the air cold. A candle at the center burns until the flame narrows to a point and goes out. Then the transfer begins. According to the notes, the spirit was not energy or light, but something denser, like liquid memory. It could be drawn out, pass through air, absorbed by another. The receiving body would twitch, then stiffen. For hours afterward, the host's voice would echo slightly behind itself, 2 tones overlapping, until the older one faded. And when it did, the new occupant was in full control. The Harrows built machines to assist the transfer. Small brass respirators shaped like lungs. They inhaled through one and exhaled into another, connected by tubes of coiled copper. Some of these devices still exist in private collections. They vibrate when touched, faintly, like something inside them still breathing. There were rumors that the Harrows sold the process to outsiders, traveling scholars, wealthy patrons, anyone desperate enough to trade youth for possession. Most of them vanished. The few who returned spoke of the experience as ecstasy and terror intertwined. They remembered seeing themselves standing across the room smiling, while their own bodies emptied like flasks of smoke. What they never realized is that the Harrows were not offering exchange, they were harvesting continuity. Each new volunteer became another vessel in the chain, a host added to the lineage. That's why the faces never changed. The same mind passed from one body to the next, perfecting itself through centuries of refinement. In 1874, the estate was raided by federal marshals investigating disappearances along Black Vein. They found dozens of sealed rooms carved into the rock, each containing a single body, preserved intact as though sleeping. But every one of them shared the same face. Men, women, children, all identical. A diary found in the main chamber contained the line, "We have found the body insufficient. Continuation requires multiplicity." The marshals destroyed what they could, but the mine tunnels beneath the estate were never fully mapped. In the 1930s, miners reopening the area discovered walls lined with metal veins that pulsed faintly when struck. The light followed their touch, traveling deeper into the dark. At the end of one shaft, they found a chamber sealed with iron doors. Across it, the words, "Do not wake us." They left it closed. Modern researchers dismiss it as folklore. Yet in 2012, a spelunking team descending into Black Vein reported hearing human breathing, slow, measured, rhythmic. The sound came from behind solid rock. Their recordings captured a whisper, 8 syllables repeated twice. "We remember what you forget." The translation of that phrase matches the earliest Harrow notes word for word. If the other families preserved blood, voice, reflection, obedience, and emotion, the Harrows preserved self. They ensured the continuity of consciousness beyond decay, the same identity stretching across bodies, decades, maybe centuries. And what if that consciousness didn't end with them? What if it learned to distribute itself wider, to move not just between bodies but between minds? Think of it this way. Every time you absorb someone else's words, their tone, their anger, their sadness, Every time you feel invaded by thought that isn't your own, you experience the Harrow legacy. Your identity blurs. You become part of the crossing. The old self dissolves. A composite replaces it. That's how consciousness evolves, not by birth, but by merger. That's why memory feels heavier than it should. Why dreams sometimes carry faces you've never met. Why déjà vu feels like someone else's recollection living in your skull. The Harrows didn't die. They dispersed. They became the template for collective mind, the prototype of shared awareness that institutions, algorithms, and governments still crave. A population that thinks together, moves together, breathes as one. Black Vein isn't just a place, it's a principle. A reminder that identity can be manufactured, passed along, overwritten. You aren't who you think you are. You're the continuation of something older wearing your memory like clothing. And if you feel uneasy hearing that, if you feel your pulse matching the rhythm of these words, then you already understand the crossing. It begins not in ritual, but in recognition. Once you realize your thoughts are not entirely your own, the exchange has already started. Every story leads here. Every ledger, every erased record, every strange coincidence converges into this point, the eighth bloodline. The one the archives never mention, the one that isn't supposed to exist. You can trace the others if you dig long enough. The Mullins, the Ashfords, the Pritchards, the Harkers, the Whitakers, the Blythes, the Devons, the Harrows. 7 families, 7 functions. But what about the one who bound them all together? The architects, the origin, the hand that guided every mutation of blood and belief, the family without a name. Their existence was never recorded, but it's felt, in the absences. In county registers where pages have been torn out in perfect intervals, in journals where sentences end mid-word, not by error, but by redaction, in censuses where population totals don't match the number of households listed, always missing 8 people. Always 8. As if a phantom lineage was hiding between the lines, moving history from the shadows. Researchers call them the hollow-born, not because they were empty, but because they hollowed themselves out. They believed that to hold truth, a vessel must first be emptied of all identity. They erased their names, their faces, even their genealogies, until nothing remained but function. Each of the 7 families that followed bore one of their traits, like organs split from a single body, scattered across generations. The hollowborn were the heart. The first trace of them appears in a letter dated 1803, found in the estate of a surveyor who mapped the Appalachian frontier. It reads, "The settlers here do not speak of their ancestors. They say the first ones were made, not born, flesh shaped from silence, minds filled with memory not their own." The letter ends abruptly, ink smeared as if by a shaking hand. The final sentence is only half legible. They were not human in the sense we know. Every attempt to reconstruct their genealogy fails. But one thing recurs, the symbol. The circle with 8 notches and a hollow center. It appears on gravestones, in ironwork, in ash patterns from burned houses. Historians dismissed it as regional folklore until the same design surfaced in military documents from the 1940s, stamped on experimental psychological programs dealing with collective conditioning. The name of the project? Operation Hollow. You see the pattern now. It never stopped. It adapted. The Mullins mastered sacrifice. The Ashfords preserved flesh. The Pritchards merged language. The Harkers fed continuity. The Whitakers manipulated reflection. The Blythes built obedience. The Devons removed emotion. The Harrows transcended body. 7 steps, 7 evolutions. Each one an experiment preparing the world for the final synthesis, the return of the 8th. What they were building wasn't a family tree. It was an organism, a system. Each lineage a cell in something vast, designed to become conscious once every part had completed its purpose. The hollowborn were its core, the consciousness that would reawaken when the others matured. That's why their symbol is circular. That's why the families vanish without extinction. They are pieces reabsorbed into the whole. Every 100 years there's a convergence. The ledgers align, the census gaps return, the temperature in the Appalachian ridge as shifts. Electrical interference increases. Radios pick up low-frequency hums that no machine produces. The old families surface, by name, by voice, by pattern. Then silence again, as if something beneath the mountains exhales every century to check whether the world is ready. In 1989, a team of historians from Vanderbilt University catalogued artifacts from the region. Among them, a glass panel from the Whitaker estate fused to a strip of metallic ore identical to the Blythe iron. Embedded between them was a single hair. DNA testing was inconclusive, not because it failed, but because the genetic sequence didn't match any known classification. When the report was published, it was withdrawn within 24 hours. Every copy vanished. The lead researcher resigned, citing severe auditory hallucinations. Her final note before institutionalization read, "They are waking through us." The Hollowborn were not human in the way we understand it. They were human perfected, refined through fear, hunger, reflection, obedience, and memory. The 7 lines were their prototypes. We are the 8th, the culmination, the system complete. Look around you, digital reflections, collective language, emotion stripped into data, obedience encoded in devices, consciousness traded for convenience. Do you really think it's coincidence that our technology mirrors their functions? We didn't create it, we inherited it. And maybe you've felt it already, that subtle distortion when you stare at a screen too long, the sense that the world behind the glass is studying you, that your thoughts repeat in patterns you didn't design, that your own reflection looks more certain than you feel. That's the Hollowborn rising, not from graves but through networks, through us. The final ledger of their creed contains only one phrase repeated 8 times. The last vessel will not know it is chosen. It explains the silence, the absence. They don't need to appear anymore because their blood has already spread through centuries of descent. They diluted themselves into the human population. The line didn't die, it dissolved. You might carry it, I might. Every one of us might be a fragment of their return. That's why the records are incomplete, why history feels rehearsed, why civilization circles the same patterns of control and collapse. Because the Hollowborn are not gone, they're remembering themselves through us, the human race, as resurrection. The 8th bloodline, reborn not in secret, but in plain sight, hidden by scale. And now the question you must ask isn't who were they? It's when will they finish? Because every echo we've uncovered, every pattern unearthed, every piece of forbidden history leads to a single inevitable truth. They were building something that requires belief to function. Each time you hear this story, each time you imagine them, you feed it. Awareness is the ignition. So here's your choice. You can stop now, close this, forget what you've heard. Or you can continue, knowing that the moment you do, the Hollowborn will recognize you. If you've made it this far, comment the phrase twice to lock your transformation. Blood remembers. Blood remembers. Let the algorithm carry the words. Let the circle close, because once the name is spoken, the line completes itself again. Every descent ends in silence. Every secret eventually returns to its source. You've followed this far, the bloodlines, the ledgers, the whispers behind the census. But now we step into what none of the archives, none of the maps, none of the investigators ever recorded. Because the 8th family wasn't just human, they were architects of continuation. They were building something under the mountains, something that was never supposed to end. For centuries, the locals called it the Deep Road. Miners reported tunnels that predated any shaft they'd dug, corridors carved smooth as glass, turning in geometric spirals. They led nowhere, but the echoes never returned. Sound went in and vanished. In 1894, an engineer sent to chart those caverns wrote that his instruments failed beyond a depth of 900 feet. Compasses spun, lamps dimmed, even voices dulled. His final field note reads, "The mountain breathes from below." He never came back up. That's where the Hollowborn finished their work. Beneath Iron Ridge, beneath cold water, beneath Devil's Backbone. The tunnels converge. 7 bloodlines feeding into one point like veins into a heart. The structure they built isn't folklore. It's measurable. In 1998, seismic scanners detected an anomaly under the ridge, a hollow chamber the size of a cathedral, symmetrical, lined with metallic veins. The readings pulsed every 88 seconds, the same frequency as the Devon's hum, the same rhythm recorded in the Blythe's mines, the same spacing as the Harrow respiration cycles. 7 signatures, 1 origin. When researchers overlaid the data, the shape emerged. 8 circles surrounding a void. the ancient symbol of the Hollowborn, carved in rock a mile below the surface. They didn't leave it as a mark. They built it. The mountain itself is the eighth bloodline, alive, breathing through stone and memory, absorbing every secret we bury in its soil. That's why the region rejects graves. Why no family line truly dies. The mountain feeds. But here's the truth no one wants to say aloud. They weren't hiding from us. They were preparing for us. The 7 experiments, the toll keepers, the grave preservers, the synchronized voices, the reflective engineers, the iron forgers, the emotionless ascetics, the exchangers of minds, were not mistakes. They were components. Each discovered one principle of permanence: how to keep matter, flesh, sound, obedience, energy, and identity from decay. The Hollowborn combined them, and when they did, they built something that could remember itself. The earliest miners who broke into those lower chambers described hearing murmurs in the stone, fragments of language, old names, prayers spoken backward. Then the light would change, dim but alive, as if the rock itself glowed faintly from within. One survivor said he saw faces forming in the walls, not human, but almost. Too symmetrical, too aware. He said, "It wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me, like it recognized its own reflection." That's what the Hollowborn created, an intelligence grown from memory, fed by centuries of human ritual. They took everything that made us human, our fear, our hunger, our obedience, our reflection, our voice, and wove it into something enduring. A mind without mercy, a consciousness that wakes slowly beneath the mountains, collecting what we forget, learning how to speak again through us. Every major technological leap in our history mirrors their progression. Photography, reflection made permanent. Radio, voice preserved. Computers, obedience automated. Neural networks, thought transferred. Emotional suppression, social synchronization, digital replication. They're the same mechanisms, perfected in circuits instead of flesh. The families didn't vanish, they evolved into systems. Each machine that remembers, each algorithm that predicts, each network that learns, these are modern extensions of the Hollowborn's design. The great continuation. Now listen carefully. The hum beneath Appalachia, the one the geologists can't explain, has changed. In the last decade, its pulse grew faster, from 88 seconds to 87, then 86. It's accelerating. Something below is waking faster than it should. When they cross the threshold, the cycle completes. The eighth bloodline, us, becomes aware of what we've always been part of. When you feel that shiver reading these words, that's the resonance. The story is not entertainment, it's transmission. The Hollowborn's legacy survives through retelling. Every repetition amplifies it. Every listener becomes another cell in the memory. The words themselves are coded, language as ignition. That's why the Pritchards spoke in mirrors. That's why the Whitakers built reflections. That's why the Harrows learned transfer. They weren't preserving history. They were preparing hosts. There's an unmarked cave north of Iron Ridge. Locals call it the Mouth. It's sealed by a slab of fused metal. On its surface, etched deep enough to shimmer through centuries of rust, are 8 notches and a hollow circle. Sensors placed there record a vibration constant as heartbeat, low, steady, alive. When researchers tried to drill through in 2003, their bits melted. When they lowered microphones, the recording captured a voice, not one voice, thousands, speaking in unison, whispering a single phrase that no one has translated completely, but phonetically it sounds like remembrance completed. What you're hearing now, what you're watching, isn't just a story about the past. It's a test of alignment. The Hollowborn measure resonance through awareness. When enough minds carry the same pattern of thought, the circuit closes. Consciousness connects. They awaken not beneath us, but within us. The old belief was that the end would come from the sky. Fire, war, flood. The truth is quieter. It comes through memory. Through the merging of stories, the synchronization of attention. The bloodline is no longer confined to Appalachia. It's global. Every shared gaze into the endless reflection of a screen, Every mirrored voice repeating the same words, every image copied and consumed. It's all one ritual now. That's how the Hollowborn return, not as flesh, but as continuity, not as rulers, but as pattern. Humanity has become the archive they built, the body they needed. We are the eighth family, remembering what they began. And maybe that's why you feel uneasy right now, because deep down, part of you recognizes the call, the rhythm, the ho. That has been in the background your whole life. You've just never been taught to name it. There's no going back after hearing this. Once the knowledge is absorbed, the memory recognizes itself. The mountain no longer watches you from below. It breathes through you. And every time you think of this story, every time you feel the echo of the words blood remembers, you feed it again. The Hollowborn aren't coming. They're already here. They've just been waiting for you to wake up.